Welcome back everyone to another vintage lens review. This time we're reviewing two lenses and putting them head to head. It's the battle of the vintage 135s. The 1980s Sears 135 f2.8 versus the 1970s Salagor 135 2.8. First, some brief history. Neither Sears nor Salagor actually manufactured lenses. Both companies rebranded and marketed lenses that were produced in Japan or Korea. This made sense at the time, as Sears was a juggernaut in the retail world and had brand recognition in the United States. Salagor, on the other hand, was known as a third-party lens seller since the late 1960s, commissioning their lenses from companies in Japan. Over time, they began offering lenses designed to compete with the big guns like Canon and Nikon, offering fast primes and constant aperture zooms. Just think of them as Vivitar, but based out of Germany. So how do they stack up against each other? Let's start with the Sears 135 f2.8. The first thing you'll notice is how light this lens is, even though it's made out of metal. The focus on this lens is super smooth and comfortable with its grippy rubber focus ring. The aperture is very clicky and goes from f2.8 to f22 with click stops in between. Close focusing is a little under 1.5 meters or 5 feet with a 52 diameter filter thread size. It has 6 aperture blades, which isn't that exciting. It'll just give you hexagon bokeh when you stop down. The markings on the body of this lens have a very simple design, kind of going for that minimal Leica look. It also has that vintage style retractable lens hood and weighs 13 ounces. This particular 135 model was made in Korea. There's a great review by an awesome YouTube channel called Vintage Optiks of an earlier model of this lens that was made in Japan. I'll put the link to that video in the comments below. Now that's all well and good, but how does it perform? First, I need to add an adapter so I can fit it on my Z6. I use this Fotasy adapter I got from Amazon. They're inexpensive, made of metal, and easy to use. Red dot to red dot, white line to white line, and we're ready to shoot. There's no other way to say it. This lens is surprisingly good for its price point. It's relatively sharp wide open, and it sharpens up even more as you stop down. There's no ghosting or hazing while shooting wide open, it's just sharp. The bokeh is very pleasing as it either melts away the background like a 135 would or creates interesting bokeh. The color rendition is warm and unique. The black and whites it renders have a vintage texture to them. You're also going to notice some vignetting that doesn't ever seem to go away, even when you stop down. But this is something that can be fixed in post. The Sears 135mm also has another drawback: chromatic aberration in the highlights. But again, in 2020, this too can be removed or adjusted in photos and video. One last thing, and it's really not that noticeable, but this lens is a little short on the focal length when compared to other 135mm, as you can see in these sample pics. Overall, considering its aftermarket price and availability, this lens is a great performer. But this is a comparison review. Time for the Soligor 135 f2.8. Like the Sears 135mm, this is also a lightweight lens with all metal construction, coming in at 14.6 ounces. It has a wonderfully smooth focus throw with 6 aperture blades and f-stops from f2.8 to f22. Close focusing is also a little under 1.5 meters or 5 feet. It also has a retractable hood. That is where the similarities end. This lens was made in Japan, and while being a similar length to the Sears 135mm, the body has a larger diameter with a 55 diameter filter thread size, which gives a nice solid feel in your hand. There are no in-between click stops on the aperture ring, which goes from f2.8 to f4 to 5.6 and so on. Adding to the solid feel of this lens, the Salagor 135mm has a metal focusing ring, kind of like those Super Takumars or Miranda lenses, which Salagor has a history with. The lens also has these rib tabs or flanges for your fingers to easily turn in already soft clicking chrome aperture ring. And while you don't need the flanges to turn the aperture ring, they do add to the overall look and style of the lens. It's a cool looking lens. How does it perform? Right off the bat, the lens is about a half stop brighter than the Sears 135mm at all stops. So even though they're reading the same aperture specs, the brightness is noticeable, but it is not as sharp as the Sears 135 wide open. At f2.8, the Salagor has a dreamlike feel with interesting, almost swirly bokeh. Stopping it down sharpens it up. And while the bokeh is pleasing most of the time, it can get a little messy at certain distances. Colors are vibrant and on the cooler side of the spectrum. The black and whites look wonderful. Unlike the Sears 135mm, the vignetting cleans up at f4, and chromatic aberrations are well controlled. Flaring is rainbow-like and frequent when pointing near a light source, which is not the case on the Sears 135 lens, which does lose contrast, but the flaring doesn't get completely out of control. And just like in the last video, this vintage style flaring is going to be a love or hate feature for many when it comes to this lens. Overall, the Soligor 135mm lens is a good performer as a photo lens, which is what it was intended for. It has its strengths, being bright and fast, but it can be used for video applications because of its softness. The flaring and blooming is a cinematic style that many want, and it's all the rage for indie filmmakers with multiple companies making ProRes filters to create the look the Soligor 135mm is already producing. And in case you were wondering, the Super 35 equivalent cinema lens would be around 96mm T2, like this Snyder Cine lens for $7,750. Or you can get a Salagor 135 f2.8 at a bargain on the internet. Play around with it, see if you like it. I'm just saying. Is there a clear winner between these two 135mm f2.8 prime lenses? They're both relatively inexpensive. They both have a vintage vibe that is unique to each lens. They both produce beautiful images in their own way, and both are that classic 135mm that creates compression and flattering imagery to your content. So I say, check them both out. Let me know what works for you, leave a comment below, and we'll see you on the next lens review.